The village of St. Mary Mead was particularly radiant that June morning, as though the very sun had conspired to illuminate the pristine lawns and flower beds of the community's cherished summer fete. Birds darted cheerfully between the hedges, their songs weaving a delicate counterpoint to the gentle murmur of villagers arranging tables, bunting, and displays of homegrown produce. The fete, held annually on the grounds of the vicarage, was a tradition that brought together the entire community, from the elderly widows with their endless gossip, to the young mothers balancing toddlers and trolleys, to the occasional visitor passing through on the Brighton road. Miss Marple, seated quietly on the far edge of the vicarage lawn beneath the shade of a blossoming cherry tree, observed the preparations with her habitual, unassuming scrutiny. Dressed in her usual modest attire, a soft lavender blouse and a long grey skirt, she held a small notebook in her lap. Not for any official purpose, but to note, in her own way, the intricate patterns of human behavior. She had arrived early, as was her custom, not to participate directly, but to see and understand, as she often remarked to herself, the small telling gestures that revealed so much about character. The air was redolent with the scent of roses and freshly cut grass, mingling with the less fragrant aromas of fried dough from a makeshift stall at the far end of the lawn. Children dashed past, waving ribbons and squealing in delight as they darted around the maypole, their laughter bright enough to lift even the most preoccupied adult spirits. At the heart of the fete, the vicar, Reverend Mr. Clement, was attempting to orchestrate a harmonious opening ceremony, though his mild, anxious nature made the task seem far more arduous than it appeared. Miss Marple's attention, however, was drawn not to the vicar or the children, but to the various villagers who had begun to congregate. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, the vicar's neighbour and local hostess extraordinaire, was fussing over the arrangement of the prize-winning flower displays, her hands fluttering nervously as she whispered sharp instructions to her helpers. She cast frequent glances toward Miss Marple, who returned them with an innocuous smile. Dolly Bantry had always been a creature of conspicuous energy, determined that nothing would mar the annual fete, not even a sudden summer shower. Nearby, the newcomer to St. Mary Mead, Mr. Edward Hargrove, was engaged in polite conversation with several villagers, a perfectly groomed man with a quick smile and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Miss Marple made a small note, polite, attentive, yet with a trace of calculation in his posture. One learned, she thought, to distinguish between the natural warmth of familiarity and the warmth that was strategically offered. At the refreshment tent, Mrs. Alice Simmons and her daughter, Margaret, were arranging the sandwiches with painstaking care, ensuring that cucumber and smoked salmon were presented in neat, symmetrical rows. They conversed in hushed tones about the inevitable competition for best culinary display. Miss Marple, ever sensitive to the small tensions that often foretold greater dramas, allowed her mind to drift over the relationships of these seemingly ordinary folk. There was, she reflected, always a quiet theatre playing behind the polite smiles of St. Mary Mead. By mid-morning, the fete was fully underway. The sound of a small brass band, arranged by the local schoolmaster, filled the air, while the laughter and chatter of villagers created a pleasant hum that masked, ever so slightly, the undercurrents of rivalry and resentment Miss Marple had begun to detect. In one corner, Mr. Philip Blake, the retired banker, was boasting to a group of gentlemen about his recent investments, his voice slightly louder than necessary, as if to drown out some unspoken insecurity. In another corner, Mrs. Fanny Craddock, a widow with a notoriously sharp tongue, whispered to her neighbour about the latest improprieties she had observed in the village, her eyes flickering with a barely contained mischief. Miss Marple sipped her tea quietly, her gaze drifting from one cluster of villagers to another. Her thoughts wandered to the small, seemingly inconsequential details. The way Mrs. Bantry's hands trembled ever so slightly when she spoke to Dolly Bantry, the restless tapping of Mr. Hargrove's foot as he smiled at Mrs. Simmons, the brief, fleeting look that passed between Margaret and Philip Blake when no one else was watching. Small things, she noted, but they were often the keys to understanding the greater currents beneath polite civility. As the morning progressed, a sudden commotion arose near the maypole. Children had gathered around a small table displaying the prizes for various competitions, and it seemed that a misunderstanding had occurred regarding the allocation of ribbons. Voices rose, a minor scuffle ensued, and the band momentarily paused its cheerful playing. Miss Marple, however, was unmoved. Small conflicts, she knew, were nothing unusual at such gatherings. It was the subtle human reactions to such conflicts that often revealed more than the events themselves. By late morning, the village had settled into a rhythm, the initial bustle giving way to a gentler, more contented pace. Yet, as Miss Marple noted with her keen eye, not all was as harmonious as it appeared. Whispers passed between villagers, too cautious to be casual, eyes shifted more than necessary, and some smiles were less than sincere. There was an undercurrent of tension, a barely perceptible tautness that only someone as observant as she could detect. And it was at precisely that moment, just as the vicar lifted his hand to make a short, welcoming speech, that the calm, sunlit scene was pierced by a sudden, shrill scream. Heads turned sharply toward the source, the flower tent near the north hedge, where Mrs. Dolly Bantry herself had been arranging the prize exhibits. Villagers rushed forward, a mixture of curiosity and panic in their steps. Miss Marple, calm and measured, rose slowly, her mind already sorting the possibilities. Something untoward had occurred, something serious. What it was and how it would unfold was yet unknown. But Miss Marple, with her quiet, unassuming presence, was already preparing to observe, to listen, and to understand. For in the village of St. Mary Mead, appearances were never as simple as they seemed. The scream had drawn nearly every villager to the flower tent, where Mrs. Dolly Bantry now stood pale and trembling, clutching her hands as though to stop them from shaking entirely. The cause of her distress was immediately apparent. A body lay sprawled across the neatly arranged displays, a dark stain spreading across the hem of an otherwise immaculate dress. For a brief moment, the cheerful Fete seemed suspended in disbelief. Ribbons fluttered in the breeze, children froze mid-laugh, and even the brass band's trumpets faltered in awkward silence. Reverend Clement was the first adult to reach the scene, pushing gently through the crowd with the air of a man suddenly aware that his pastoral duties extended far beyond blessing cakes and awarding prizes. "Everyone, please step back," he said, his voice quavering slightly despite the command. He knelt beside the figure, a woman of middle age, known to the villagers as Mrs. Veronica Blake, wife of Mr. Philip Blake, the retired banker, and checked for signs of life. Her face was pale, unnaturally so, and her eyes closed. The vicar's heart sank. Whatever had happened, it was no accident. The crowd murmured among themselves, speculation blooming like the flowers around them. Mrs. Fanny Craddock, never one to waste time on subtlety, raised her voice above the general hum. "It's terrible, absolutely shocking, but do you know I had my suspicions about Veronica for months, ever since that little incident at the garden club." She trailed off, allowing the tension in her words to hang like a heavy curtain, giving the crowd space to fill in their own imaginings. Mr. Edward Hargrove, standing near the back with a polite hand resting on his chin, observed the reactions with careful composure. "I hardly think this is the place for conjecture," he said softly, though his eyes flicked toward Philip Blake, who had just arrived, looking pale and bewildered. The retired banker's lips pressed into a thin line, and he murmured something inaudible before stepping closer to the body. "Veronica?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. A few villagers noticed, though they quickly turned their attention to whispering about the scandal rather than showing compassion. Miss Marple, meanwhile, remained at the edge of the gathering, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the assembled crowd. Her mind catalogued every subtle reaction, the faint tightening of Mrs. Simmons's lips, Margaret's hand brushing nervously against her apron, Dolly Bantry's jittery insistence that no one move the flowers, as if preserving the arrangement could somehow preserve innocence. The human heart, she reflected, revealed itself in its smallest tremors, and it was in these tremors that the truth often resided. Within minutes, gossip began to ripple through the assembly like a rising tide. "I suppose it must be robbery gone wrong," someone whispered, though their own eyes betrayed doubt. Another voice suggested a heart attack, murmuring about Mrs. Blake's occasional complaints of fatigue, though there was no evidence to support the claim. "Or perhaps it's Philip," a bold young woman said, nodding toward the husband. "I heard them quarreling last week about some property matter. You know how money makes tempers flare." Heads turned, eyebrows raised, and a chorus of murmurs followed, each theory mingling with the next, none rooted in certainty, but all swelling in the collective imagination. Meanwhile, the children, whose initial curiosity had been tinged with fear, were hastily gathered by Mrs. Simmons and escorted to a distant corner of the lawn. Their small voices, once a vibrant counterpoint to the fete, were now subdued whispers, and they glanced over their shoulders at the scene with wide, anxious eyes. Miss Marple, with gentle attention, noted the way even the youngest ones observed adults' expressions, how the tiny humans had already learned to read tension and suspicion. The vicar, realizing the severity of the situation, instructed that the local constable be summoned immediately. Constable Harris, a mild-mannered man who prided himself on keeping St. Mary Mead unusually peaceful, arrived promptly. He glanced over the body and then at the crowd, scratching his head. "I'll need everyone to give statements," he said, though his voice lacked the confidence of someone accustomed to true crises. "We must find out what happened here." Villagers shifted uneasily, each wondering if they might be asked to betray a neighbor or reveal something they would rather keep hidden. As the constable began questioning witnesses, the subtle theater of human behavior came fully into view. Mrs. Bantry's agitation had not diminished. She flitted between individuals, directing attention, ensuring that no one removed the evidence of her carefully arranged flowers. Mr. Hargrove, polite and composed, offered calm words of reassurance, though Miss Marple noted that he observed reactions as much as he spoke, almost as if assessing the crowd rather than assisting in the crisis. Philip Blake, meanwhile, remained rooted to the spot, his hands clenched tightly at his sides, his gaze shifting between the vicar and the crowd, never settling, never resting. The whispers grew louder as villagers speculated on motive. Jealousy, revenge, financial disputes. Each offered explanation carried weight precisely because it could be true. Miss Marple, ever observant, did not engage in the gossip, though she allowed herself the quiet satisfaction of noting who leapt too quickly to judgment and who remained measured in their commentary. It was always the latter who provided the most valuable clues. In the heat of panic, subtlety revealed far more than bravado ever could. By noon, the body had been carefully moved and the flower tent partially cordoned off, though the air remained heavy with unease. Conversations lingered around half-formed suspicions. Villagers speculated on alibis, past grievances, and hidden rivalries. Miss Marple, taking a small sip of her tea as she observed from a discreet distance, allowed the murmurs to wash over her, cataloguing reactions with her usual meticulous attention. She knew that the answers would not be found in shouting or speculation, but in the quiet, telling slips of human nature which she had spent a lifetime learning to read. And so, while St. Mary Mead busied itself with conjecture, Miss Marple already began the careful process of piecing together a picture that none of the villagers yet imagined. A picture in which every whispered, secret, and nervous glance might hold the key to understanding the truth behind the tragedy at the Summer Fête. By the early afternoon, the fete had been reduced to a quiet murmur, the bright laughter and music replaced by uneasy whispers and the occasional clatter of a displaced teacup. The constable, accompanied by a visiting inspector from the county seat, had taken charge of the scene. Villagers were called one by one to give statements, their expressions ranging from eager to defensive, while Miss Marple remained unobtrusive, seated on a bench near the edge of the lawn, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. She listened more than she spoke, for in the careful observation of human behavior, words often proved far less revealing than the silences between them. Miss Marple's gaze first fell upon Philip Blake, standing by the remains of the flower tent, with his hat clutched tightly in his hands. He had said little since the initial shock, his lips pressed together, his brow furrowed. Yet there was a rigidity to his posture, a tension in his shoulders that suggested both grief and something more, a cautious watchfulness, as if measuring the reactions of those around him. Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his right hand when he adjusted his cuff, and she made a discreet mark in her notebook. Subtle, yet telling. Nearby, Dolly Bantry hovered, her expression a mixture of fear and indignation. She directed questions toward the constable about preserving the flower displays, insisting they remain untouched until the inspector arrived. "One must maintain order," she declared, though her voice carried an edge that betrayed agitation. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. People's need to assert control often revealed where their anxieties truly lay, and Dolly Bantry was no exception. Margaret Simmons, clutching her apron as though it offered protection, was questioned about her proximity to the tent. She stammered, her eyes darting nervously toward her mother and then to Edward Hargrove, who had positioned himself at a respectful distance. Miss Marple's sharp eye caught the flicker of recognition between Margaret and Mr. Blake, an almost imperceptible acknowledgement that they shared knowledge neither had yet revealed aloud. These small, involuntary gestures were far more informative than any statement crafted under pressure. As the inspector moved through the crowd, his notebook open, he occasionally asked pointed questions. "Did anyone see Mrs. Blake immediately before?" he began, only to be interrupted by a chorus of, "I didn't see anything," and "we were too far away." The villagers' collective defensiveness was palpable. Miss Marple, quietly observing, considered the psychology behind it, the natural instinct to protect oneself or one's friends, the fear of implication, and the delicate social dance of a small village in which every neighbor's opinion weighed heavily. It was Edward Hargrove who next caught her attention. He spoke with measured calm to the inspector, offering precise details of what he had seen, yet his eyes roamed the crowd almost imperceptibly. Miss Marple's instincts told her he was not merely cooperative. He was studying, assessing, cataloging reactions as if performing an experiment in human behavior. Polite, attentive, precise, yet with a shadow of calculation. She made a mental note. He was not likely to be the perpetrator, but he would be valuable to watch. Meanwhile, Mrs. Fanny Craddock had stationed herself close to the inspector, eager to offer unsolicited commentary. "I always thought there was something rather peculiar about Veronica," she whispered loudly enough for a small group to hear. "She was too proud, too proper, always hiding what she truly thought, and Philip, well, he had his own airs, didn't he?" The inspector nodded politely, while Miss Marple raised a discreet eyebrow. Fanny's observations were colored with imagination and suspicion, yet they revealed what she considered important, her own judgments of character, which often reflected more about herself than the subject of a gossip. As villagers continued to be interviewed, Miss Marple observed patterns emerging. The loudest voices, the ones most eager to speculate, were not necessarily those with the clearest knowledge. Those who appeared the most composed were often withholding details they considered sensitive or perhaps incriminating. And in the briefest exchanges, an averted glance, a hand trembling, a pause too long, she began to glimpse the threads of connection that bound these seemingly unrelated individuals to the tragic event. Reverend Clement, feeling the weight of responsibility, approached Miss Marple quietly. "I'm afraid this has cast quite a shadow over our fate," he murmured, his voice low as if confiding a secret. Miss Marple offered a faint smile. "Yes, Reverend, though sometimes a shadow can reveal things that daylight alone cannot. It is remarkable what human nature discloses under pressure." The vicar nodded, taking comfort in her calm, understated wisdom, unaware that she was silently assembling the mosaic of motives and opportunity that would eventually clarify the darkness surrounding them all. The inspector, growing slightly frustrated by the slow pace of tangible information, turned to Philip Blake. "Mr. Blake, was there any tension at home recently? Disagreements? Arguments?" Philip's eyes widened slightly, though he composed himself quickly. "There have been minor disagreements, nothing serious," he replied. Miss Marple's attention lingered not on the words, but on the micro-expressions, the slight downward twitch at the corner of his mouth, the brief narrowing of his eyes, the way he subtly adjusted his position when speaking. Such gestures, minute though they were, spoke volumes. By mid-afternoon, the constable had begun cataloguing possessions, making notes of the scene with a methodical attention to detail that contrasted sharply with the villagers' emotional turbulence. Miss Marple wandered discreetly among the tables, her gaze flicking over small details, the slightly disturbed petals of a rose, a ribbon that had been pressed too firmly against a table, a chair angled away from the center of the tent. Each item, seemingly insignificant, contributed to the broader picture. Through it all, Miss Marple said almost nothing, content to allow the inspector and villagers to speak, to reveal themselves through words, gestures, and reactions. In a small town like St. Mary Mead, she reflected, human behavior rarely concealed the truth entirely. It merely demanded patience and attention to discern its meaning. The truth, she mused, was not always what it appeared to be at first glance, and often waited in the quiet, unremarkable corners that most people overlooked. By the time the sun had climbed high and shadows lengthened across the village green, Miss Marple had begun to form a quiet, preliminary map of motives, opportunities, and the subtle interpersonal tensions that defined the relationship surrounding Mrs. Blake. The fete, once a cheerful gathering, now hummed with unease, and the villagers, though outwardly composed, carried the weight of suspicion and speculation like an invisible cloak. Miss Marple, seated once more beneath her cherry tree, observed in silence, knitting as the murmurs continued around her. She had learned long ago that the first impressions, the hurried statements, and the obvious suspects rarely held the final answers. Patience, keen observation, and a careful mind were required to untangle the human web. And in St. Mary Mead, she was already beginning to see the threads, the hidden rivalries, the quiet resentments, and the subtle gestures that would eventually illuminate the truth behind the tragedy of the Summer Fête. By late afternoon, the inspector's questions had taken a sharper, more pointed turn. The initial shock of the discovery had passed, and the villagers now stood in small, uneasy clusters, whispering among themselves, eager to pin responsibility on someone, anyone who might explain the horror that had erupted in their otherwise serene community. In such circumstances, it was often the most obvious, the most convenient person who became the first suspect. Philip Blake, still pale and rigid from the morning's events, found himself at the center of attention. Though he had protested his innocence from the outset, the inspector's questions, focusing on recent disagreements, minor financial disputes, and neighborhood gossip, cast a shadow over him. "You were seen speaking sharply to Mrs. Blake just days ago," the inspector said, his tone neither accusatory nor gentle, leaving the suggestion to fester in the minds of those around. "And you had the motive to dispute her plans for the garden estate." Philip swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. "We had minor disagreements, as any married couple might," he said evenly, though Miss Marple caught the subtle trembling in his fingers as he adjusted his hat. The villagers, observing from a respectful distance, began to murmur. It was a natural reaction, she knew. The mind seeks a culprit to restore order, and the husband was, by default, the most convenient choice. Mrs. Fanny Craddock, standing a few paces away with her hands clasped tightly, leaned in to whisper to the nearest neighbors. "I thought it would be him from the start," she said, her voice low but urgent. "Always so controlled, so certain of his own opinion. I've known men like him before. You'll see. He won't withstand scrutiny for long." Her words, intended to sway opinion, reflected the ease with which small-town assumptions could solidify into collective judgment. Miss Marple, however, observed with quiet detachment. She did not allow herself to be swayed by the chorus of speculation, nor did she let her mind rush to conclusions. Instead, she noted each reaction, the slight stiffening of Philip's shoulders when questioned, the minute flicker of annoyance in the inspector's eyes at his careful responses, and the suppressed curiosity of Edward Hargrove as he watched Philip navigate the scrutiny. All were pieces of the same puzzle, yet none alone indicated guilt. At the refreshment tent, Mrs. Dolly Bantry flitted about with a degree of nervous energy that made her an object of suspicion in the inspector's mind. She may have been trying to preserve appearances, Miss Marple reflected quietly. But appearances are often the greatest camouflage. Dolly had been meticulously controlling the flower displays, ensuring that nothing was disturbed, and her insistence on preserving order while seemingly innocent also spoke to her desire to manage perception. Could anxiety, desire for control, or resentment manifest in a more sinister way? Miss Marple filed the thought away for later consideration. Margaret Simmons, though visibly shaken, was called forward as well. The inspector's questions hinted at her knowledge of domestic details, who had access to the vicarage grounds, who might have entered the flower tent before the tragedy. Margaret's responses were hesitant, her voice faltering under scrutiny, yet Miss Marple's sharp observation noted inconsistencies in the villagers' recollections rather than in hers. Subtle gestures, such as Margaret's quick glance toward Hargrove when asked about timing, revealed shared awareness, though of what exactly Miss Marple did not yet know. Edward Hargrove remained outwardly calm, offering factual statements with the precision of a man careful to protect both himself and the truth. His posture, however, suggested readiness, as though he anticipated further developments and measured every reaction. Miss Marple's mind registered it all. The gentleness with which he addressed nervous villagers, the careful modulation of his voice, and the way he subtly encouraged truthfulness without revealing his own thoughts. A man like him, she concluded, could be an ally, or a silent observer of human weakness, documenting each misstep. Constable Harris, eager to close the case with the clarity his limited experience allowed, grew increasingly focused on Philip Blake. "It seems simplest, Inspector," he suggested, "to consider Mr. Blake's involvement. He had motive, opportunity, and a visible reaction to the scene. Sometimes the obvious answer is the correct one." Miss Marple allowed herself a slight inward sigh. Simplicity, in her experience, was often a trap. The truth, she knew, rarely presented itself so conveniently. The villagers, meanwhile, began to solidify their opinions. "I always thought he was a cold man," Mrs. Craddock whispered, her eyes narrowing. "Look at the way he doesn't cry, doesn't scream, nothing perfectly controlled. That's the sort who hides everything behind a polite face." Others nodded, some in agreement, others out of fear of being judged for dissenting. Gossip in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple observed, functioned like a living organism, growing rapidly in response to fear and uncertainty, feeding on the natural desire to restore order. Yet, even as Philip Blake was surrounded by suspicion, Miss Marple quietly considered the inconsistencies that did not fit. The husband's grief appeared genuine, despite the crowd's assumptions. The timing of events, as recalled by multiple witnesses, did not match the simplicity of the narrative forming around him, and the subtle signs, the nervous avoidance of certain villagers, The faint blush of Margaret when questioned, the measured calm of Hargrove, suggested a more complex picture. Miss Marple allowed the inspector to continue, knowing that the process of assembling a first suspect was as much about observing the community's reactions as it was about examining evidence. Each accusation, each whispered hint, was a mirror, reflecting not only the supposed guilt of Philip Blake, but also the hidden motives, anxieties, and secrets of the villagers themselves. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the lawn, the inspector finally made a formal statement. "For the time being, we must consider Mr. Blake as a principal suspect," he announced. "We will continue our inquiries, but we cannot ignore the evidence of opportunity and motive, however preliminary." The words landed heavily in the crowd. A collective exhale, half of relief, half of judgment, swept through the assembled villagers. Miss Marple, knitting calmly beneath her cherry tree, did not react. She knew better than anyone that the first suspect was rarely the final answer. The villagers, eager for resolution, would cling to Philip Blake as the embodiment of their fears, but the truth, like a carefully hidden seed, waited quietly to be uncovered. And Miss Marple, patient and unassuming, already had the faint outlines of the hidden pattern beginning to take shape in her mind. A pattern far more intricate than anyone, including the inspector, had yet suspected. The evening sun slanted low over the village green, casting long shadows across the Fete grounds, yet Miss Marple's attention remained entirely on the subtleties of human behavior rather than the shifting light. While the inspector busied himself with questioning Philip Blake further and the constable attempted to piece together timelines, she wandered quietly among the tables, her eyes scanning not the obvious evidence, but the minute, almost imperceptible irregularities that only a trained observer could detect. It was then that she noticed it, a small, almost trivial detail that would have escaped any ordinary eye. Near the edge of the flower tent, among the carefully arranged roses and peonies, a single ribbon had been dislodged, its satin sheen slightly frayed at one end. Not significant in itself, one might think. Yet Miss Marple's experience had taught her that such trifles often told stories that words could not. The ribbon had been pressed against a table, slightly uneven, as if it had been moved in haste, or perhaps deliberately disturbed. She crouched slightly, her gaze following a faint smear on the tent's canvas, almost invisible in the evening light. It was neither blood nor anything immediately recognizable. Rather, it was a dark streak that suggested contact with something damp or greasy. Most villagers would have dismissed it as a smudge from flowers, children, or spilled tea. Miss Marple, however, made a careful note. Minor, inconspicuous, yet telling. Whoever had brushed past this point had done so deliberately, or had inadvertently revealed something they hoped to conceal. Her mind drifted back to the villagers, recalling each face, each gesture, each fleeting reaction. Edward Hargrove, for instance, had lingered near the tent at one point, his attention curiously precise, almost analytical, as if observing not just the event itself, but the manner in which others reacted. Margaret Simmons had brushed past the area moments before the discovery, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged the sandwich platters. Philip Blake had remained mostly stationary, yet she remembered the subtle tension in his shoulders when his wife's name was mentioned, an unconscious response rather than an overt action. The ribbon, in Miss Marple's mind, was a kind of pointer, a minor, overlooked artifact that carried significance precisely because everyone else dismissed it. Her thoughts drifted to how such details often connected the past to the present. She remembered similar incidents from decades of village life, small signs left unconsidered that, upon reflection, revealed motives, opportunity, and even guilt. Human nature, she mused, could never entirely disguise itself. Its fingerprints lingered in the most unremarkable places. Her musings were interrupted by the arrival of Reverend Clement, who approached with cautious deference. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, I'm afraid the inspector insists on another round of questioning. It seems we must exhaust every possibility, however tedious." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze never leaving the slightly frayed ribbon. "Indeed, Reverend. One must consider all angles, even those that appear insignificant. Often it is in such corners that truth hides." The vicar inclined his head, aware that her quiet wisdom surpassed formal authority in subtle yet profound ways. Meanwhile, the villagers' conversations continued to hum around her. Fanny Craddock, ever eager to comment, whispered to Dolly Bantry about Philip Blake's supposed coldness. Margaret Simmons, seeking reassurance from her mother, barely noticed Miss Marple's observation. Each reaction, each careless word, became a thread in the tapestry that Miss Marple was silently weaving, a tapestry that for now remained invisible to all but her. A slight noise from the far side of the tent drew her attention, a soft scuffing of shoes along the grass. Miss Marple glanced discreetly in the direction, her eyes catching a subtle shift in shadows near the hedge. There, barely noticeable, was a small footprint in the soft earth, partially obscured by fallen petals. Too narrow for an adult man, too large for a child, and bearing a distinct shape, it suggested someone moving hurriedly, attempting to leave no trace yet leaving one nonetheless. Most would have overlooked it entirely. Miss Marple, of course, did not. Her thoughts began to trace the possibilities. Could this footprint belong to someone whose presence at the tent had been unnoticed or deliberately ignored? Who had moved past the ribbons, brushing against the flowers in a manner that seemed casual, yet was calculated? She reviewed in her mind the sequence of arrivals and movements she had observed, the flitting energy of Dolly Bantry, the nervous adjustments of Margaret Simmons, the measured poise of Edward Hargrove, and the subtle reactions of Philip Blake. Each had intersected the scene in small ways, leaving traces of anxiety, attention, or intent. Then there was the pattern of conversations. Villagers tended to speak more freely under the assumption that others were preoccupied. Small remarks, overheard by Miss Marple, revealed opinions and half-truths. Philip's disagreement with Veronica, Margaret's discreet mention of a misplaced bouquet, Edward's polite suggestion about the arrangement of the prize ribbons, all were minor statements, but, collected together, they formed a network of relationships, tensions, and potential motives. As the shadows deepened, Miss Marple made another quiet observation. The way the ribbon's frayed edge pointed toward the small gap in the hedge that led to the lane behind the vicarage. A casual glance might suggest coincidence, yet she suspected otherwise. Whoever had passed through had touched it, or at least brushed nearby, leaving a faint trail of intention. In her mind, she began to connect the ribbon, the smear, the footprint, and the interactions she had so carefully catalogued. Each minor element added a dimension to the otherwise chaotic scene. By twilight, while the inspector continued to interrogate the villagers in a more formal manner, Miss Marple retired to her bench beneath the cherry tree once again. The ribbon and the faint smear, together with the subtle shifts in human behavior she had catalogued, formed the foundation of a nascent understanding. The answer, she knew, would not be found in overt accusations or official procedure, but in the quiet, overlooked details that most dismissed as unimportant. And so, as the Fete's bright colors faded into evening, Miss Marple's keen mind traced the hidden outlines of the day's events. In the shadows of St. Mary Mead, among the whispering villagers and the scattered petals of the flower tent, she had already begun to see the faint but distinct threads of the truth, a truth that everyone else had ignored, but which, in time, would reveal itself fully. By the following morning, the village of St. Mary Mead had shifted from shock to tense curiosity. The tragedy at the Summer Fête hung over every conversation, coloring even the most mundane interactions with suspicion. Villagers moved carefully through the familiar streets, glancing at neighbors with furtive interest, while Miss Marple, ever discreet, observed the ripple effects of fear and conjecture with quiet intensity. The small details she had noted the previous day, the ribbon, the smear, the footprint, occupied her mind like faint constellations in a dark sky, each ready to guide her to the truth. The first of the confrontations arose at the vicarage itself. Philip Blake had returned home, pale but determined, and soon found himself approached by Dolly Bantry, who had decided that it was imperative to know whether he intended to cooperate fully. "Philip, you must understand," she said briskly, her hands fluttering in anxious gestures. "The villagers are talking. You simply must explain yourself." Philip, rigid with fatigue and emotion, replied calmly yet defensively, "Dolly, I have done nothing. Why must everyone assume the worst?" His voice, though measured, carried an edge of frustration that drew subtle murmurs from those nearby. Miss Marple, seated quietly in a corner with her knitting, observed every nuance. Dolly Bantry's agitation revealed far more than her words did. The way she pressed forward, leaning slightly closer, indicated a need to assert control, or to manage not just Philip, but the perceptions of everyone who might overhear. Philip's reaction, the mixture of exasperation and careful restraint, spoke of a man conscious of both his vulnerability and the scrutinizing gaze of the village. Subtle, yet revealing. Elsewhere, Margaret Simmons had confided in her mother that she had overheard a heated argument between Veronica Blake and another villager, one that had taken place just days before the fete. Mrs. Simmons, flustered yet insistent, added, "I didn't think it was serious. They quarrel all the time over trivial matters, but now—" Her voice trailed off. Miss Marple's attention flicked to Margaret as she spoke, noting the small signs of nervousness, the frequent brushing of her fingers against her apron, the fleeting glance toward the open window. Each of these gestures hinted at awareness of things unspoken, truths not yet revealed. The village tea room became another stage for subtle confrontations. Mrs. Fanny Craddock had summoned a small gathering of her acquaintances, eager to discuss her own suspicions of Philip Blake. "I always suspected he was a man who could hide his true feelings," she declared, leaning in with a conspiratorial air. "And I do think Veronica knew more than she let on. I should have expected trouble." As the women whispered among themselves, Miss Marple listened silently from a distant corner, noting the way assumptions hardened into supposed facts in the minds of the community. Small prejudices, nurtured by gossip, often masked more complex realities. Edward Hargrove, meanwhile, had begun his own subtle inquiries. Moving quietly from one neighbor to another, he offered gentle questions and careful listening, never imposing his own judgments. Miss Marple, observing him with keen interest, realized that he was extracting information without revealing his intentions, a skill that, though uncommon, was invaluable in uncovering hidden truths. His calm presence had already begun to influence those around him, encouraging honesty, even when fear or embarrassment might otherwise prevail. The most revealing confrontation, however, occurred when Dolly Bantry encountered Margaret Simmons alone in the village square. "Margaret, do tell me everything you saw." "Everything," Dolly demanded, her voice trembling with urgency. Margaret hesitated, then, emboldened by the privacy, revealed the details she had previously withheld. A glimpse of someone lingering near the flower tent shortly before the tragedy. A fragment of conversation suggesting a hidden grievance and a subtle gesture. A brush of hands that had seemed accidental but, in hindsight, hinted at intention. Dolly Bantry's eyes widened, but Miss Marple, observing from across the street, remained calm. Small gestures, observed and interpreted, often revealed more than full confessions. Back at the vicarage, Philip Blake faced another subtle confrontation, this time with Reverend Clement himself. The vicar, gentle yet firm, asked, "Philip, I must know if there is anything unresolved between you and Veronica that might have led to this." Philip's response was immediate, defensive, and precise. Nothing that could justify what happened. I loved her, and I would never harm her. Yet his eyes betrayed the strain of repeated questioning, the burden of grief, and the awareness of judgment from all directions. Miss Marple noted the truth in the tension between Philip's words and his gestures. Grief, not guilt, shaped his reactions. Throughout the village, other secrets began to surface. Mrs. Craddock's casual remarks led to the discovery of a long-standing rivalry between Veronica Blake and a lesser-known local matron, a feud that had simmered for years over seemingly trivial matters of propriety, gardening, and social precedence. Margaret Simmons's earlier hesitation hinted at an unspoken knowledge of minor indiscretions, while Edward Hargrove's quiet questions revealed that some villagers had been withholding information out of fear or embarrassment. Each revelation layered complexity upon the already intricate web of human relationships, creating a tapestry in which motives multiplied and opportunities seemed to lurk in every corner. Miss Marple, knitting calmly in her chair by the window of the vicarage, catalogued these revelations with meticulous care. Every word, every glance, every subtle movement was a clue, not in isolation, but as part of a greater whole. She saw how fear, rivalry, and shame interwove with grief, how the instinct to protect oneself often collided with the impulse to accuse, and how the smallest overlooked detail might ultimately illuminate the larger truth. By mid-afternoon, the village square had transformed into a stage of tension and revelation. Conversations, once casual and cheerful, were now punctuated by hesitations, glances, and careful probing. Villagers who had once been casual acquaintances now confronted each other over past slights, grudges, and hidden resentments, unaware that their own confessions were silently observed by Miss Marple. She, in turn, catalogued the interplay of emotion, timing, and opportunity, piecing together a network of connections and potential motives that no single witness or document could convey. As the sun dipped toward evening, Miss Marple's quiet reflections confirmed what she had long suspected. Beneath the polite civility of St. Mary Mead lay a tangle of desires, grudges, and secrets, each influencing actions and reactions in ways that could easily escalate into tragedy. And in that tangle, she thought, lay the answer to the mystery that had so disrupted their peaceful summer fete. The morning following the confrontations brought a chill to St. Mary Mead, not merely from the crisp air that swept the village lanes, but from the unease that seemed to have settled over the community like a heavy fog. The previous day's events had already set hearts racing with anxiety and speculation, yet today, something even more unexpected threatened to unravel the fragile semblance of order. A second incident, subtle yet disquieting, that cast new shadows over the investigation. It began with a letter. Miss Marple found it slipped beneath her door, folded with meticulous care, the handwriting elegant but unfamiliar. She opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the words with quiet curiosity. Some truths are better left buried. Do not pry too deeply, or consequences will follow. The note was unsigned, yet its intent was unmistakable. Someone in the village had noticed her keen observations. Someone wished to intimidate her, or perhaps to test her. Miss Marple, knitting needles resting momentarily against her lap, allowed herself a faint smile. Villagers often underestimated her, assuming the quiet, elderly lady with a fondness for gossip and knitting was incapable of reading more than a face at a tea party. In truth, she read the human heart with a precision few could match. Meanwhile, in the flower tent where the tragedy had occurred, the inspector discovered that several prize ribbons had been mysteriously repositioned overnight. What had initially seemed a minor detail, the careful arrangement of the displays, now revealed a subtle tampering. A red ribbon previously pinned to a particularly exquisite rose bush had been moved to a lesser bloom, while the yellow ribbon for best vegetable was askew, as though deliberately misaligned. On the surface, trivial, beneath it, an intentional signal or perhaps a misdirection. The villagers gathered once more, drawn by curiosity and fear. Dolly Bantry, already jittery from the previous day's events, was the first to voice concern. "It seems the garden tent is disturbed again," she said, her hands wringing in her apron. "I cannot imagine who would do such a thing." Yet Miss Marple, seated quietly on a nearby bench, recognized the pattern. This was not mere vandalism or carelessness. Whoever had moved the ribbons understood the attention paid to details. They wished to draw eyes, to manipulate perception, to control the narrative without exposing themselves directly. The inspector, less attuned to subtleties than Miss Marple, initially considered it a prank by the more mischievous village children. "Probably a harmless joke," he muttered. Yet Miss Marple noted the absence of footprints other than the small, narrow one she had previously observed. Children rarely left so calculated a trace, nor did they possess the careful knowledge of village routines that the repositioning implied. No, she thought, this was deliberate. It was Margaret Simmons who inadvertently deepened the mystery. While arranging teacups for the afternoon gathering, she casually mentioned, "I did see someone near the hedge late yesterday evening, though I couldn't tell who it was. They seemed to be moving carefully, almost as if trying not to be noticed." Her words were hesitant, almost whispered, but Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. The careful movement matched exactly the subtle disturbance of the ribbons. It suggested a presence at the scene after the initial tragedy. Someone revisiting, someone orchestrating a deception intended to mislead. Philip Blake, still recovering from the previous day's scrutiny, appeared once more in the village square. His eyes, usually expressive in their quiet grief, now reflected a mixture of bewilderment and concern. Villagers, quick to seize on new developments, looked to him immediately, suggesting in hushed tones that his involvement might extend beyond the initial suspicion. Miss Marple, however, observed more closely. His movements were hesitant, almost protective, as though he wished to maintain the integrity of the tent rather than manipulate it. The distinction was subtle, but to her it spoke volumes. Even Edward Hargrove, whose measured calm had previously suggested insight, displayed a small flicker of unease. He lingered near the flower tent, ostensibly to offer assistance, yet his attention constantly returned to the disordered ribbons. Miss Marple suspected he too was considering possibilities, though the nature of his calculations remained hidden. Certain villagers, Dolly Bantry and Mrs. Craddock in particular, misinterpreted his vigilance as culpability, fueling gossip and spreading tension through St. Mary Mead like wildfire. The subtlety of the new events, combined with the villagers' tendency toward conjecture, created an atmosphere charged with paranoia. Small incidents, a displaced teacup, a whispered warning, a door left slightly ajar, were magnified into potential evidence of malice. The Summer Fête, which had begun as a scene of communal joy, had transformed into a theater of suspicion and intrigue, where every gesture, every glance, carried weight. Miss Marple, of course, observed all without judgment, aware that in such an environment, the most crucial truths often hid behind layers of distraction and misdirection. By mid-morning, a new piece of information emerged. The vicar reported that several of his parishioners had received similarly cryptic notes, each implying that secrets should remain hidden. The effect was immediate. Whispers of a larger, orchestrated effort began to circulate, suggesting that someone in the village was deliberately attempting to manipulate perception, to control the flow of information, and perhaps to conceal culpability behind layers of misdirection. Miss Marple, knitting steadily beneath her cherry tree, reflected on the significance of these developments. The second incident, ribbons moved, cryptic notes delivered, was not merely coincidence. It suggested a cunning hand at work, a mind capable of subtlety, patience, in the orchestration of others' assumptions. Whoever it was, she thought, had anticipated human behavior and was using it to shield themselves. It was precisely this kind of calculated misdirection that often concealed the truth in plain sight. As the afternoon wore on, the villagers' attention was drawn again to Philip Blake, whose tentative involvement in rearranging the ribbons was speculated upon with hushed urgency. "It must be him," whispered Mrs. Craddock. "He knows the tent best. He could move them easily without being seen." Miss Marple, knitting calmly in her corner, merely observed. The true significance of the disturbances lay not in the obvious manipulations, but in the subtle choices made by someone seeking to deceive. The deception, she noted, was elegant and almost theatrical, relying on expectation rather than force. By evening, the tension in St. Mary Mead had reached a delicate, almost unbearable height. Villagers eyed one another cautiously, wondering who might next act, who might hold secrets yet undiscovered, and who might finally break under scrutiny. Miss Marple, however, felt no anxiety, only a deepening sense of clarity. The threads were beginning to converge, revealing a pattern that most would not yet recognize. The hidden hand behind both the tragedy and the subsequent subtle misdirection was deliberate, precise, and clever. And Miss Marple, patient as ever, knew that in time even the cleverest deception would reveal its flaws. By the early evening, St. Mary Mead had settled into an uneasy rhythm, the village life continuing with a fragile semblance of normality. Yet Miss Marple knew that beneath the polite smiles and whispered gossip, the truth still lingered, hidden in plain sight. The second incident, the disturbed ribbons, the cryptic letters, had revealed the cunning of the perpetrator, but had not yet disclosed their identity. She resolved it was time for a delicate test, one subtle enough to prompt a revealing reaction without raising suspicion. Miss Marple invited Edward Hargrove to join her for tea at the vicarage, offering the suggestion under the guise of a casual chat about village events. Edward, politely, flattered, accepted, unaware that the meeting had a purpose beyond conversation. Miss Marple had noticed his vigilance at the flower tent, the way his eyes had followed subtle movements, and she wished to gauge whether he possessed knowledge he had not shared. Knowledge that might connect him to the hidden manipulation of the fate. As they sat in the quiet parlor, the warm afternoon light falling across the floral wallpaper, Miss Marple began with gentle observations about the village. "The ribbons," she remarked casually. "Such little things, yet capable of stirring so much interest. It's fascinating how a minor alteration can ignite a storm of gossip and suspicion." She watched Edward carefully, her eyes soft, unassuming, yet piercing. Edward nodded, careful to appear casual. "It is curious," he said. "Some people take the smallest details far too seriously. One misplaced ribbon, and suddenly everyone is watching one another, assuming the worst." His tone was smooth, but Miss Marple noticed a slight tightening at the corners of his mouth, a tiny hesitation that suggested more awareness than he admitted. "I suppose," Miss Marple continued, "some disturbances are deliberate, though, are they not? Not every misplacement is accidental. People have motives even when it seems inconceivable." She selected her words with care, her voice casual but laden with implication. She was not accusing, only planting a seed. The key was to observe the reaction, the subtle shift in expression, posture, or speech that might betray concealed knowledge. Edward's eyes flickered briefly, the kind of micro-expression that Miss Marple had learned to read with patience. He adjusted his posture, clearing his throat before replying. "Certainly, some actions are deliberate. But I would hope the villagers are innocent until proven guilty." He smiled faintly, yet his fingers drummed nervously against the teacup, a signal that his mind was calculating, evaluating her words with care. Miss Marple allowed a short pause, pretending to sip her tea, and then asked lightly, "Do you suppose anyone could be clever enough to manipulate suspicion without ever being seen? Someone capable of creating a chain of events so subtle that the eye would notice only what the mind chooses to perceive?" She looked at him, letting her gaze linger as though casually admiring the sunlight on the lace curtains. Edward's hand stilled mid-drum, and his smile faltered slightly. "I suppose, in theory, it is possible," he admitted, "but it would require extraordinary forethought and an understanding of human nature that is uncommon in a village such as ours." Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. His choice of words, extraordinary forethought, was precise, almost too precise, revealing that he recognized the possibility as familiar rather than abstract. "Indeed," she said softly, "some people understand human nature better than most. They know what will be observed, what will be assumed, and how fear can be used to conceal intention. It is quite fascinating, isn't it?" Her tone was conversational, almost innocent, yet she noted the slight tightening of Edward's jaw. Miss Marple knew that discomfort, hesitation, or overemphasis often marked a guilty conscience or the concealment of critical knowledge. Edward shifted, adjusting his chair slightly as though to distance himself from her scrutiny. "It is fascinating," he echoed, but his eyes betrayed the faintest trace of unease. Miss Marple continued with her subtle test. "And some people," she added, "might even attempt to mislead others with trivial details, a ribbon here, a note there, things that seem unimportant but actually guide perception in precisely the direction intended." The faintest blush colored Edward's cheeks, almost imperceptible, but enough for Miss Marple to notice. He leaned back, clearing his throat and fixing his expression into polite neutrality. Miss Marple allowed the pause to stretch, knitting methodically as though absorbed in her task. Patience, she knew, would invite him to reveal more than he intended, for the mind struggles to contain information when subtle pressure is applied without overt accusation. Finally, she offered a concluding observation, framed innocuously. "It is a delicate art," she said, "understanding how fear, expectation, and gossip can be used to hide one's own actions. I've seen it before, many times. Small villages, polite faces, yet underneath, a complexity that only patience and observation can unravel." She set her knitting aside and looked directly at Edward, her gaze calm, almost benign, yet probing. Edward shifted in his seat again, and now the tension was unmistakable. He clasped his hands over his knees, his voice steady but slightly defensive. "You are remarkably perceptive, Miss Marple. I admit, your observations often surprise me, but surely one can only deduce so much without knowing all the facts." His eyes, however, flickered toward the window, betraying his anxiety. Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "Of course, facts are important. Yet sometimes, the smallest details, those that seem trivial to most, carry the weight of truth. One must only observe carefully and wait. People reveal themselves, often inadvertently, through hesitation, overemphasis, or small inconsistencies." Edward's gaze met hers fully for the first time in their conversation, a fleeting tension passing through his expression. Miss Marple allowed the moment to linger. She did not press further. The subtle unease she had observed, combined with the prior evidence, the displaced ribbons, the cryptic notes, the unnoticed movements at the tent, was enough. He had revealed what words alone could not, the faint, involuntary reactions of a mind engaged in concealment. As the sun dipped lower, spilling gold across the garden, Miss Marple rose gracefully, collecting her knitting. "Thank you, Edward. You have given me much to consider." Her voice was warm, entirely without accusation, yet every word had been chosen to test, to observe, to provoke a reaction that would confirm or deny her suspicions. Edward, for his part, remained composed outwardly, but Miss Marple had already recorded the subtle tells, the micro-expressions, the tension, and the fleeting blush. Each had been a piece of the puzzle, and now the final image was beginning to emerge, clear and undeniable, within the quiet clarity of her mind. The village hall, usually a place of cheerful gatherings and community meetings, now hummed with a quiet tension. Chairs had been arranged in a loose circle, and Miss Marple sat near the center, knitting resting in her lap, her gaze calm and unassuming. Around her, the villagers assembled. Philip Blake, pale but dignified. Dolly Bantry, fidgeting nervously. Margaret Simmons, hesitant and anxious. Edward Hargrove, composed yet perceptibly tense, and the ever-curious Mrs. Craddock, eager to witness the resolution of the mystery that had so unsettled their summer fete. The inspector, standing near the doorway with a clipboard, glanced from face to face, awaiting the announcement that would bring closure to the days of uncertainty. Miss Marple, however, was unhurried. She allowed a moment of silence to settle, observing each person carefully. Every shift of weight, every flicker of expression, every subtle gesture was a clue, a confirmation, or a contradiction. The truth, she knew, was patient. It would reveal itself in its own time, and she would guide the villagers to see it without accusation, with only gentle illumination. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began softly, her voice carrying a calm authority that drew attention without demand. "The past few days have been unsettling, and it is natural that we have each wondered how such a tragedy could occur in our peaceful village. But I believe the time has come to understand, and perhaps to find peace." She paused, glancing briefly at Philip, whose hands clenched lightly in his lap, though his face remained composed. She started with what everyone had observed, the initial disruption of the summer fete, the tragic death of Veronica Blake, the small yet precise disturbances of the flower tent, and the cryptic letters that had followed. "It is easy," she said, "to assume that the most obvious person bears responsibility. Yet in my experience, the simplest answer is rarely the correct one. Villagers, attentive to what is immediate, often overlook the subtleties that reveal true intention." Her gaze drifted toward Edward Hargrove, though it appeared casual, as if it were resting on nothing in particular. "Let us consider the ribbons," she continued, drawing the villagers' attention. "A single misplaced ribbon, a minor smear, a faint footprint, all seemingly inconsequential, but, as in many human interactions, the smallest detail often reveals more than the grandest display." She gestured lightly toward the arrangement of chairs, as though the gesture itself were part of her narrative. Who among us had both the knowledge and the subtlety to manipulate these elements while remaining unseen? The villagers exchanged glances. Dolly Bantry wrung her hands. Mrs. Craddock leaned forward, and Margaret Simmons shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Philip Blake remained rigid, his expression calm but wary, as though he knew the forthcoming explanation would vindicate him. Miss Marple's eyes, serene yet incisive, scanned each face, noting micro-expressions, the faint tension in Edward's jaw, the nervous flutter of Margaret's hands, the heightened attentiveness of Mrs. Craddock. Each provided confirmation of what her mind had long suspected. "The answer," she said, "is someone who understood human nature with precision. Someone who could predict reactions, anticipate fear, and manipulate perception without resorting to force. The notes, the ribbons, even the initial incident, all were orchestrated to guide suspicion toward another." Her voice was gentle, but every word carried weight. Edward Hargrove's composure faltered, just slightly, as if he had suspected this moment might arrive. Miss Marple continued, uninterrupted. "Consider the movements at the flower tent. The narrow footprint, too small for an adult male, yet deliberate. The displaced ribbons, indicating both familiarity and subtle misdirection, and the cryptic letters, designed to intimidate those who observed too closely. Who among us exhibited the patience, cunning, and understanding of human behavior necessary to execute such a plan?" She let the question hang for a moment, allowing the villagers to weigh the possibilities. Whispers circulated, eyes darting from one neighbor to another. Philip Blake's pale dignity suggested innocence, while Dolly Bantry's anxious movements suggested concern rather than culpability. Margaret Simmons's hesitation hinted at knowledge but not execution, and Edward Hargrove's hands, lightly clenched on his knees, betrayed the faintest tremor under the calm exterior. Miss Marple rose gracefully, her knitting set aside. "It was you, Edward," she said softly, her tone devoid of accusation, yet undeniable in clarity. "You manipulated the evidence, you orchestrated the subtle disturbances, and you relied upon the villagers' natural assumptions to deflect suspicion. You were careful, yes, but human behavior is never perfectly controlled. Small gestures, fleeting expressions, hesitation, they all reveal the truth in ways even the cleverest mind cannot fully conceal." Edward's face remained composed, but his eyes betrayed recognition, and for the briefest moment, a flicker of defeat passed across his features. He opened his mouth to protest, yet Miss Marple continued, calmly narrating the sequence of observations that had led her to the revelation. The ribbons pointed toward the hedge, the footprint indicated a deliberate route, and the cryptic letters were designed to mislead. You had reason to hide your actions, but in your subtle control of events, you revealed yourself. A hush fell over the room. Dolly Bantry gasped quietly. Mrs. Craddock leaned back in disbelief, and Margaret Simmons' hands trembled lightly as she covered her mouth. Philip Blake exhaled, relief spreading across his features as the tension that had weighed upon him began to ease. The inspector, clipboard in hand, nodded slowly, realizing that Miss Marple's deductions were precise, unassailable, and grounded not in speculation, but in the careful study of human behavior. Miss Marple allowed a final moment for comprehension to settle. "It is often the case," she said, her voice gentle, "that human nature leaves traces invisible to the casual observer. Actions, reactions, and even small manipulations carry meaning. One must only be patient, observant, and considerate of the subtleties that others overlook. Edward, in your careful orchestration, you did not account for these small truths." Edward Hargrove finally spoke, his voice calm but resigned. "Yes," he admitted, the single word carrying both acknowledgement and the weight of inevitability. The room seemed to exhale as understanding spread. Miss Marple's deductions, quiet and unassuming, had untangled the web of deception without accusation, revealing the truth in a way that allowed the villagers to confront reality with dignity. The inspector stepped forward, offering Edward a polite but firm request to accompany him. Philip Blake remained seated, his relief palpable, while Dolly Bantry dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Miss Marple returned to her chair, retrieving her knitting, her expression serene. She allowed the villagers to absorb the revelation, knowing that the restoration of order required both understanding and the subtle reassurance of clarity. In St. Mary Mead, life would resume, but with a sharper awareness of human nature and the hidden depths of those around them. And Miss Marple, ever patient, had once again demonstrated that the smallest observations, carefully noted, could unravel the most carefully constructed deception. The village of St. Mary Mead slowly exhaled, as though releasing a held breath it had been carrying for days. The revelation of Edward Hargrove as the orchestrator of the subtle manipulations had resolved the immediate tension, yet the air remained tinged with unease. People returned to their routines, yet no one moved quite as freely as before. Every familiar street, every garden gate, now seemed to carry a faint echo of suspicion and of secrets once hidden. At the vicarage, Philip Blake resumed his duties with a quiet dignity, though he often paused, glancing toward the flower tent with a mixture of relief and lingering sorrow. Veronica's absence was a wound still tender, yet the knowledge that he had been exonerated allowed him to navigate his grief without the added burden of false guilt. Dolly Bantry, ever devoted to supporting her friends, flitted about with renewed energy, her attention divided between practical concerns and the lingering intrigue of human nature that Miss Marple had so subtly revealed. The Summer Fête itself, though no longer the scene of a gathering, became a point of reflection for the villagers. The ribbons that had been moved, the cryptic letters, the subtle clues, they were now items of discussion rather than tools of suspicion. Mrs. Craddock, whose curiosity had sometimes bordered on meddling, lingered at the village green, recounting the story with exaggerated drama to anyone who would listen. "Imagine it," she exclaimed to a small group of neighbors, "all orchestrated by Edward with such cunning. Who would have guessed? And to think we all suspected Philip." The villagers nodded, some laughing nervously, yet the amusement was tempered by an awareness of how easily human perception could be deceived. Miss Marple, of course, did not participate in the gossip. She preferred quiet observation, her knitting a constant companion, her mind cataloguing the lessons that each incident had offered. As she moved through the village, she noted the subtle shifts in posture, the cautious exchanges of glances, the lingering hesitations in conversation. Even in the return to routine, the subtle truths of human behavior remained visible to her trained eye. Margaret Simmons, who had been hesitant and anxious during the investigation, gradually regained her confidence. She returned to helping at the vicarage, her movements more assured, her voice steadier. The experience had left its mark, a heightened awareness of her own perceptions and the understanding that appearances could be deceptive. She occasionally met Miss Marple's eye and nodded in quiet acknowledgement, as if sharing an unspoken appreciation for the lessons of observation and patience. The inspector, meanwhile, documented the case with meticulous care. The facts were clear. Edward Hargrove had manipulated the ribbons, orchestrated the cryptic letters, and relied upon human assumptions to divert suspicion, yet the explanation lacked the subtlety, the insight into human nature that Miss Marple had provided. He often found himself consulting her notes and recollections, acknowledging, though rarely aloud, that the resolution had relied more upon psychology than upon any tangible forensic evidence. The village's social routines gradually resumed, though with a touch of guardedness. The next Sunday service saw neighbors greeting one another with polite smiles. Yet beneath the cordiality lay an awareness that even in small communities, human behavior could conceal both kindness and cunning. Garden parties were planned with careful attention to detail, and summer gatherings took on a quieter tone, each villager mindful that appearances could be deceiving. In the privacy of her own home, Miss Marple reflected on the events of the past week. She considered the delicate interplay of fear, expectation, and human curiosity that had allowed Edward to manipulate perception so effectively. She also acknowledged the resilience of the villagers, their capacity to adapt, to recover, and to embrace truth once it had been gently revealed. In the quiet of her sitting room, with the late afternoon sun streaming through the lace curtains, she felt a profound satisfaction. Justice had been achieved, not through confrontation or accusation, but through patient observation and understanding. The village children, less aware of the subtleties that had ensnared the adults, returned to play with innocent delight. Their laughter, ringing across the lanes and gardens, served as a gentle reminder of the ordinary joys that persisted even in the aftermath of disruption. Miss Marple often watched them from her window, noting how their movements were candid and unguarded, so different from the carefully measured gestures of the adults. Such observations reinforced her understanding of human nature, the capacity for innocence and honesty, even amidst the complexities and duplicities of village life. Dolly Bantry, in particular, continued her efforts to maintain a sense of normalcy, organizing small gatherings and social events that encouraged conversation without judgment. She often sought Miss Marple's counsel, though always discreetly, valuing the detective's insight into human behavior and the subtleties of perception. Miss Marple, in turn, offered guidance with gentle suggestions rather than direct instruction, allowing the villagers to draw their own conclusions and find confidence in their renewed understanding of one another. The summer sun dipped lower each day, bathing the village in a golden light that seemed to soften the edges of recent events. Gardens bloomed with a renewed vibrancy, and the familiar sounds of birdsong and rustling leaves gradually reassured the villagers that life continued. Yet Miss Marple, ever vigilant, remained attentive to the subtleties that often escaped others. She knew that beneath the apparent calm, human nature retained its depth and complexity, capable of both kindness and cunning, honesty and deception. In the quiet moments, knitting in hand, Miss Marple considered the delicate balance that had been restored. The subtle psychological manipulation, the deliberate misdirection, the small gestures that had revealed the truth, all were testament to the intricacies of human behavior and the necessity of careful observation. The village would return to its routines, yet it would do so with a sharper awareness, a recognition that even in the most peaceful of communities, the hidden currents of desire, fear, and intention could ripple beneath the surface. As the evening descended over St. Mary Mead, the village seemed to exhale once more, this time in relief. The mystery was solved, justice served, and the lessons of human observation firmly etched into the consciousness of those who had witnessed it. Miss Marple, with her knitting beside the hearth, reflected quietly on the enduring truths of human nature, that patience, attentiveness, and subtle understanding could reveal what force or accusation never could, and that even the smallest details, carefully noted, might illuminate the grandest truths. The village of St. Mary Mead had settled once more into its familiar rhythm. The echoes of suspicion had faded, leaving behind a subtle awareness of the intricacies that underlie even the quietest communities. Children played in the lanes, their laughter drifting through the afternoon air, while neighbors greeted one another with the gentle ease of routine restored. Yet beneath the surface, every villager carried with them a quiet understanding. Appearances could be deceiving, and human nature was rarely as straightforward as it seemed. Miss Marple sat by the window of her small sitting room, knitting in hand, watching the sunlight spill across the garden. She reflected upon the events of the past week, the tragedy, the misdirections, and the revelations that had exposed Edward Hargrove's cunning. To an outsider, it may have seemed a simple case of observation and deduction, but for Miss Marple, it had been a study in the delicate interplay of human behavior, the hesitations, the micro-expressions, the unguarded moments that speak louder than words. The subtle manipulations, the cryptic notes, the carefully arranged ribbons, all of it had been designed to control perception, to guide suspicion away from the true culprit. Yet in the end, it was patience, quiet observation, and understanding of the human heart that had revealed the truth. Justice had been served, not through confrontation or force, but through insight and perception, the tools Miss Marple had wielded since her earliest days in the village. She considered the villagers themselves, each shaped by their experiences of the Summer Fête. Philip Blake, relieved and vindicated, would carry forward with dignity. Dolly Bantry, ever vigilant and devoted, would continue to nurture the community. Margaret Simmons, newly confident, would navigate future uncertainties with greater awareness. And Edward Hargrove, now exposed, would face the consequences of his actions, though Miss Marple knew that even in his cunning, he had revealed something universal, the persistent human desire to control, to deceive, and to manipulate, even in the gentlest of communities. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the horizon, where the sky shifted from gold to soft pink, and the first stars began to glimmer. She mused upon the enduring truth that each mystery revealed. Human nature, she reflected, is never static. It is an intricate web of motives, desires, fears, and impulses, and it is through careful attention to these subtleties that understanding and justice emerges. In the quiet of her sitting room, she allowed herself a small smile. The village had endured, and life would continue, enriched by the lessons of observation and awareness. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the chaos of human mischief, however cleverly orchestrated, could ultimately be unraveled, not through force, but through insight, patience, and gentle perception. As evening fell and the lights of St. Mary Mead twinkled in the windows of the cottages, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. Each stitch, each rhythm reminded her of the intricate patterns that life and human nature often wove. And in that peaceful reflection, she understood that the truest mysteries are not merely solved by logic or evidence alone, but by the careful and patient study of the human heart. Thus, the Summer Fête became a memory, a story of intrigue and revelation, of small details carrying great significance, and of a quiet detective whose understanding of human nature brought clarity, justice, and subtle wisdom to the village she so cherished. Life in St. Mary Mead returned to its gentle cadence, yet for those who watched closely, the lesson remained. In every polite smile and measured word, there lies the potential for hidden truths, waiting to be discerned by the observant eye. Miss Marple, ever vigilant yet serene, continued to watch, to listen, and to reflect, ready for the next secret, the next subtle deception, knowing that patience and understanding are the keys to unveiling the most hidden of truths.